Hey friends, it's Just the Gems. I'm Brandon, and I'm a simp for the Trails series. You might know that by now, and I make no apologies for it. I love these games. I love almost everything about them, and I really want you to play them. I've already discussed on this channel whether or not you can start with the upcoming Trails Through Daybreak. You can, but I want to make a pitch for why this whole series is worth your time. So I'm going to lay out my top 5 reasons why you need to play the Trails games, if that's okay. Why a top 5 list? Because at some point in the mid-2010s, a handful of people wrote some algorithms, and now lists are the primary form of human communication. This is the world we live in. But first, if you're not already subscribed, and if you like JRPGs, would you consider subscribing? I promise, I do talk about more than just Trails. I'm very into this entire genre. But a new Trails release gets me excited in a way very few things can, hence my fervor. But yeah, if you're into JRPGs, you belong here. And if you don't, you belong here too, so long as you don't mind me telling you how great JRPGs are and why I think you should play them. Alright, so anyway, let's get into it. There have been a lot of fantastic JRPG parties over the years. The cast of Final Fantasy VII, Tales of Vesperia, Chrono Trigger. But as much as I enjoy those characters, there's just something about the cast of Trails. Each and every character is multi-dimensional, with complex personalities and deep connections to the world they live in. They're motivated by realistic goals, and they interact with each other in realistic ways. Not a single one of these games has a stinker in the entire cast, and I'm willing to go to bat for any one of these characters who might come under unfair scrutiny. Let's start with the protagonists. In Trails in the Sky 1 and 2, we of course have Estelle Bright. I've said quite a lot about Estelle on this channel, but to sum it up, she's the very picture of the positive and outgoing teenager who feels strongly and acts on her feelings. Her boyfriend Joshua is sort of a co-protagonist depending on how you look at it, and he couldn't be more different. Dark, brooding, you know the type. But he has a real kindness at his core that most of those one-dimensional dark and brooding types lack. The rest of the Sky cast is rounded out with brilliantly realized characters. Shara the Bracer, Chloe the mysterious student, Olivier the wandering bard, the list goes on, but I won't because I want to put this video out before the heat death of the universe. Sky the Third mixes things up a bit with a pair of new protagonists, Kevin and Reese. They work for the Septian Church, which is this mysterious religion that seems to factor into just about every single person's life in pretty significant ways. Kevin and Reese are on the hunt for artifacts, capital A. These are objects with strange powers that were left over from the ancient civilization that came before. Kevin's got this happy-go-lucky personality that naturally is masking some deep-seated pain, and Reese does her best to maintain a stoic demeanor despite some of her own quirky tendencies. The third really opens up cast-wise, giving you access to almost every single major character that played a role in the first 2 games. It can be a little overwhelming, but get used to games with huge casts. This isn't the only time it happens. The Crossbell games seem to be the favorites of a lot of people. Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure are really remarkable works, and a big part of that is their focus on character. Unlike in the Sky arc, with the Crossbell games, you're introduced to all the core characters straight away. Lloyd Bannings is the protagonist this time, and he's a police detective who's been teamed up with 3 other rookies. You've got Ellie McDowell, Randy Orlando, and Tio Plato rounding out the Special Support Section, or SSS. By giving us all 4 of our principal characters right up front, we're given the maximum amount of time to get to know them and see how they fit into the world. There are other characters you'll team up with as well, like Noelle and Wazi, for example, but the best developed of the whole arc are these 4 key players. Introducing most of the main characters at once worked well enough in Crossbell, so Falcom did it again in the Trails of Cold Steel arc. Here you'll take control of Reen Schwarzer, a student at a military academy in the Empire of Erebonia. He's enrolled in Class 7, which is a new experimental class that mixes together students from the nobility and students who are common-born. Reen is introduced to his classmates, which are maybe too numerous for me to list off in an entertaining way, but each of them are deep and interesting and flawed people in their own right. Whether it's the mysterious bookworm Emma, or the hardcore anti-nobility activist Machias, or the far too skilled at combat for her age, Fee, it's easy enough to find a favorite among this group. And Cold Steel only gets bigger from there. Beyond Reen's initial classmates, by the end of the arc, you're introduced to more than 40 major playable characters. And here's the thing, like I said, they're all good, all of them. None of them are dropped in there without an appropriately large amount of character development. None of them feel in any way one-dimensional. The characters in these games are just... they're so compelling, guys. They're so compelling. I'm keeping myself as spoiler-free as possible, but the bits of introduction I've gotten to some of the characters from Trails Through Daybreak, mostly in the form of some of the post-game content in Trails into Reverie, has reassured me that this strong focus on characters is continuing. I, for one, just absolutely cannot wait to fall in love with more Trails characters. Most JRPGs have a macro story and several micro stories running throughout. The macro story of Final Fantasy VII might be defeat Sephiroth, save the world. And the micro stories are everything from find a way to cross the ocean at Junon to find Aerith in the Temple of the Ancients. There's the big overarching goal and the small story beats that take place on the way to that goal. Trails adds another couple of layers to that format. There's a bunch of micro stories in each game, naturally, as quests lead into quests and more of the larger macro story gets unveiled. Though some of the games end on extremely powerful cliffhangers, for the most part, it's safe to say that each Trails game can function as its own self-contained story. But on top of that macro story level is another, I don't know what to call it, super macro story level? Sure. This super macro story level is the various arcs that the story is told in. And above that is the, ultra macro story level. The ultra macro story level is something that other games just don't have because they really can't. That's because unlike most games, Trails is telling one big interconnected story across all of its games and arcs. The closest analog I can think of is maybe all the different Final Fantasy VII games like Crisis Core and Dirge of Cerberus, but even then we're talking about a handful of games. Trails has, counting Daybreak, 11 that have been released in the West so far, and even more on the way. Trails walks a delicate line with this. Naturally, with a story this big, it can and will be intimidating for people to jump on board. That's a big part of why Falcom made the brilliant move to divide the story up into different arcs. So far, those arcs are the Sky arc, the Crossbell arc, the Cold Steel arc, and the Calvert arc. By breaking the story up into these different arcs, Falcom has created perfect places for people to jump on board without necessarily having to start with the 20-year-old Trails in the Sky. And while some would argue that the best experience can only be had if you play the series from the beginning, I'm here to assure you that that's just not true. For one thing, best is subjective as heck, and there's just no way to prove that sort of thing is true. In my mind, the best way to play Trails is just to play them. Get sucked into this story. But speaking of the story, because that is what we're speaking about in this section, right? Right. This story is crazy. Okay, so a little setup. Trails tells the story of various people around the world of Zemuria as they navigate the complex waters of war and politics, while at the same time fending off the machinations of a mysterious world-spanning organization called Ouroboros, a group made up of some of the weirdest and most dangerous people on the planet. Man, that's really oversimplifying it, but I don't want to say more than necessary here. And anyway, that's sort of the ultra macro story level stuff anyway. Each arc also has its own narrative. In Trails in the Sky, that super macro story is about Estelle and Joshua and their efforts to save their small country of Liberl from the nasty people who want to take it over, and from the jerks from Ouroboros who want to use the nation for their own mysterious purposes. In the Crossbell arc, the super macro story is about Lloyd Bannings and the SSS as they deal with all the upheaval in their small nation and try to maintain order while fighting off an evil cult and even worse people. And let's just say that the Cold Steel arc might be a bit too complicated to summarize in one pithy sentence, so I won't even try. There's a lot of stuff going on in there, just a lot of stuff. Story is king with the Trails games. Falcom set out to create a compelling narrative that tells the whole story of this world, and so far they've been knocking it out of the park. Part of me is excited to see how this all ends, and another part of me just wants it to go on forever. But like any good story, there is an end in sight, and I'm really looking forward to witnessing how the storytellers at Falcom plan to wrap it all up in the future. So I mentioned story is king with the Trails games, yeah? I said that, right? Story is king with the Trails games, right. And it is. It's also king with me. It's the primary reason I play JRPGs, and it's the primary reason Trails is my favorite JRPG series. But fortunately, the phenomenal story isn't the only thing Trails has going for it. The gameplay in this series makes it worthy of just as much praise. If you're into highly customizable, extremely tactical battles, then Trails is definitely for you. Now, naturally, the battle system has evolved quite a bit over the last 20 years. I think we'd all be more than a little disappointed if it hadn't. But up until Daybreak, the basic core mechanics have largely remained the same. In battle, you're placed on a battlefield along with your enemies, and you can do all the standard things you'd expect. Attack, use magic, use special skills. You know, all that JRPG stuff. However, Trails borrows quite a bit from more tactical RPGs in that positioning is absolutely key to success. Not only does your enemy need to be in range in order for your attack to happen, but how enemies are positioned can determine how certain attacks land. Certain characters can attack multiple enemies at once, but only if they're clustered together closely. When using magic, it's much the same, though some spells will target a specific enemy in a range of space around them, while others will only target a specific area on the battlefield, meaning enemies could potentially move out of range before the spell gets cast. This means careful planning is absolutely required in order to maximize how effective you can be. The magic system is extremely complex, at least in the earlier games. If you find it overwhelming, then rest assured it does get streamlined quite a bit in the later titles. But still, there's a lot to this system. Magic is handled through orbments, which are devices that take in small crystals called quartz and use them to create magic. Each orbment has a set number of slots you can put these quartz into, and the way in which you arrange the quartz will have an impact on which spells you can cast. Again, at least in the earlier games, this is the most confusing aspect of the gameplay by far, and it's something I'll admit I'm grateful they simplified later on. Still, if you're the type that enjoys being able to fiddle with complicated settings to maximize your power, you'll love this. If you aren't that type, then don't worry. I'm also not that type, and I still made my way through these games without issue. On higher difficulty levels, these fights can be absolute nightmares, which I'm sure is appealing for some of you out there, but in all honesty, I experienced enough challenge on normal mode, so I'll leave all that to the masochists out there. Each new entry introduces new mechanics to the battle system, like being able to have your characters team up for powerful combination attacks, or the ability to link two characters together so they can support each other in various ways. The changes to the combat are doled out bit by bit as each game comes along, and it all feels like just a natural evolution of the gameplay we're used to. I know that there are some bigger changes coming in Trails Through Daybreak, but I have enough faith in Falcom that I'm confident the changes are for the better. If you're the sort of JRPG player that's primarily in it for the gameplay, there's more than enough here to satisfy you, just like there's more than enough for story hounds like me. The Falcom sound team is much respected among the Trails and East fan bases, but I don't hear them talked about among the broader JRPG audience as much as they should be. Maybe it's because the individual composers aren't as well known. Maybe it's because these series don't quite do numbers the size of a Final Fantasy or a Dragon Quest. But regardless, the music in Trails is incredible. The Trails music has that sort of old school JRPG sound going on, which is something I have a hard time explaining, despite being a musician myself. It's the sort of music where melody is most important. In a lot of other games, and even in more modern JRPGs nowadays, there's a focus on creating a cinematic soundtrack. That's the sort of music you get from a film, where the score is written to closely follow the action on screen. And don't get me wrong, that music can be great and memorable. Hello, John Williams. But for the most part, be honest. Do you remember the music from most movies? Of course not, because it's only there to support the scene. It's not super memorable because it's designed not to be. The Trails music forgoes that style entirely and instead focuses on creating powerful and memorable tracks with strong melodies and that super vital hummability that older games pulled off so well. Not only is the music extremely well written, but there's so much of it too. Not only is each game's soundtrack massive, but since Trails games all take place in this same world, and because characters in later games will sometimes visit locations from previous games, we even get to hear some melodies from previous titles pop up from time to time. But I'm sort of burying the lead because one of the most significant things that Trails is known for is its incredible battle tracks. If there's one thing that the Falcom sound team knows how to do, it's how to rock your butt off. I hope you don't mind not having a butt, because they will rock it off. And butts don't just reattach. You have to have surgery. But in all seriousness, the battle music in this series is incredible. From hardcore rock to intense orchestral to beautiful choral, the variety and sheer amount of tracks is just mind-blowing. If you don't believe me, hop onto the music streaming platform of your choice and look up Falcom Sound Team JDK. Just listen to some of the music. These people they just rock. Around 1200 years ago, there was this ancient civilization, and something terrible happened, and it collapsed. Standard stuff, nothing too extraordinary there. But what happens next is what makes Trails so unique. For hundreds of years, the world is plunged into darkness with all sorts of strife and turmoil and war and death. But around 50 or so years before Trails in the Sky begins, something sort of miraculous happens. Orbal technology is discovered. I mentioned orbments in the gameplay section, but orbments are just one small part of this orbal revolution, as it ends up being called. What happens essentially is a world that was medieval for hundreds of years suddenly finds itself advancing technologically at an immensely fast rate. It's like magic, only really it's not. At least not entirely. By using this rediscovered ancient technology and building on it, the world begins to prosper again. Sure, it doesn't mean the end of war or anything like that, but people develop phones, cars, washing machines. Half a century into this technological boom, the equivalent of the internet comes into existence. The world of Trails is so fascinating to me because of how it blends these medieval and technological elements. You get a front row seat to this society grappling with all these changes happening at such a rapid pace. It's such a unique setting, and it's so rich with lore. I just love it. On top of the technological boom, there's also the Septian Church to consider. I mentioned them earlier in the video, but once again, they're a religion that most of the people in the world follow. They worship a goddess named Adios, who they believe has blessed them with everything they have. Among the things the goddess has given the world are the Septarians. These are 7 miraculous gifts that have enormous amounts of power. So far, each Trails arc has had 1 or 2 of these showing up as a significant plot point, and that's likely to continue as the story goes on. But aside from the Septarians, there are also the artifacts, which I think I also mentioned. These are items of super advanced technology from the Precursor Society that fell 1200 years ago, and the Church does not want to let any of them fall into regular people's hands. Does that mean that this largely unmonitored organization is amassing untold numbers of miraculously powerful objects for their own mysterious purposes? Well, yeah. But we can trust them, right? Right. And of course, there's also Ouroboros. Like I said, this is a mysterious organization that seems to be experimenting on the world using the Septarians. They're an extremely loose group. There's a hierarchy, but it doesn't seem like anybody really has any authority over anyone else, not even the Grandmaster of the whole society. The members can come and go as they please, and they can choose to disobey, seemingly without consequence. Every machination of every villainous person in this world seems to have an agent of Ouroboros somewhere behind it. Their goals are tied up with the end game of the Trails series, and watching their plans unfold slowly over the course of the entire saga is captivating. There's so much to this world, so much rich history and lore, that it's hard to wrap your head around. The great thing is, though, that if you don't want to deep dive into the lore, you don't have to. The story of each game and each arc, and even the ultra macro story, is fully understandable without bothering to read into the finer details. But the finer details are there for you to enjoy if you want them. And the consistency of those details is a big part of why I love these games so much. So there you go, 5 big reasons why you need to play the Trails games. Pick a game and just start playing it. Maybe you want to grab Trails Through Daybreak because it's coming out imminently and it's the new hotness. By all means, go for it. Or if you want to start earlier on, there are plenty of options. Regardless, my only recommendation is that you start with the beginning of an arc. That means Trails in the Sky FC, Trails from Zero, or Trails of Cold Steel 1. Subsequent games in an arc do offer some recap options, but it's still better to think of an arc as an experience in and of itself and begin at the beginning. Each arc is designed to allow you to slip in without issue. So, what do you think? Do you already love the Trails games as much as I do? Have you never played them, but are thinking maybe you want to give them a try? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Please, if you'd like the video, if you do in fact like it, that helps out so much. And also, if you aren't already subscribed, clicking subscribe would make me just about the happiest camper in the entire world. Also, if you're going to be in the Los Angeles area on July 6th, you should come to Anime Expo. I'll be hosting a panel with NIS America, not a sponsor of this video, by the way. I'm gushing about trails for free. But anyway, the panel's on JRPGs and why they're so great, and my co-hosts are none other than David Vincent and Cam Hawkins. So come and check it out and say hi afterwards. Thank you so much for watching, and hey, happy trails everyone. Until next time, bye.